Hi, everybody. It looks like everyone is starting to join in. Welcome. Thank you for joining us. I'm going to go ahead and kick off tonight. I am Tracy Poinier, president of Judy Nicholson Kidney Cancer Foundation. And I do see some familiar faces on the Zoom. Can we go ahead and mute all of our lines? I'm hearing a little bit of feedback. Thank you so much. For those of you who may be new, our mission is pretty simple: to help kidney cancer patients and caregivers navigate their journey. JNF provides education, support, and connection. We offer programs like tonight's virtual forum on navigating clinical trials, Joel's monthly A Patient Open Forum, The Art of Caregiving. That's a series we host monthly as well. Our podcast, if you haven't checked it out, it's called Real Talk on Renal Cancer. It is on Spotify and also YouTube. All of our videos, including tonight's videos, are actually uploaded to our YouTube channel. And to see all of our upcoming events, you can visit us on our website at jnfkidneycancer.org. I want to go ahead and also give a big thank you and shout out to our sponsors tonight, Merck and BMS, for making tonight's forum possible. And I just have a few housekeeping items that I want to go over before I introduce our panel of experts. Sounds like folks are still joining in. And can we go ahead and mute the lines, everybody? Thank you so much. Tonight's session is being recorded, so if you could keep it muted, I'd appreciate it. Please hold all verbal questions until the end, but feel free to go ahead and drop your questions in the Zoom chat below. We will answer as many as we can during the Q&A session. So with that, let's go ahead and get started. Clinical trials play a critical role in advancing kidney cancer treatment and giving patients access to promising new options. So we are honored to welcome an outstanding panel of experts this evening. Dr. Zakharia with the Mayo Clinic in Arizona. We also have Dr. Maughn with Huntsman Cancer Institute, and my medical oncologist and RCC expert, Dr. Michael B. Atkins with Georgetown Lombardi Cancer Center in DC, and Dr. Barata with University Hospitals Case Western Reserve. So again, thank you all for being here tonight. I'm going to go ahead and hand it over to our awesome moderator, Mark Hyatt. A lot of you are familiar with him in our Stage 4 Facebook support group. He is a Stage 4 kidney cancer survivor himself and a JNF advocate. So let's get started. Mark, I'm handing it over to you.
Thanks, Tracy. Thank you. Thank you, Tracy. Thank you to the Judy Nicholson Foundation, and doctors, and our guests. Okay, tonight we're going to do, each expert will lead with one topic with an opening question. Other panelists may contribute comments, and a question and answer will follow at the end of the discussion with the doctors. We're going to lead off with Dr. Barata. He's going to be discussing clinical trials, basics of decision making. Dr. Barata, question: can you explain what clinical trials are, how they work in RCC, and common misconceptions patients might have about trial phases, risk, and eligibility? Thank you, Dr. Barata.
Of course. Mark, thank you so much. Again, thank you for having me. Great panel, great topic, very important topic, right? In general for tumors, but specific for kidney cancer. So when you ask the question, what are clinical trials? Trials are research studies that involve patients, and they're usually designed to answer a specific question. Sometimes it's to prevent cancer, sometimes it's to detect, sometimes to treat or to manage diseases like kidney cancer. So they're critical because that's how we develop better treatments, better ways of managing the disease, and often also offer a way to get early access to promising therapies before they get widely available. So how do trials work in kidney cancer? So in kidney cancer, trials can involve different things. They can test new treatments or combinations of treatments. Immunotherapy and target therapies combinations or different immunotherapies combinations is an example. There are examples of that. They also may involve sequencing of treatments, meaning what comes first, what comes next, and we figure that out through clinical studies. Sometimes it involves delivery methods like oral medication versus IV, and we can compare them and see how we do, and then we get that data out there. Or sometimes it involves specific biomarkers. What that means is that a way for us to match the treatments to a specific marker that might be in the tumor and where it works when that marker is present and it doesn't work when that marker is not present. So as you can see, trials can involve many different things. And of course, the idea of running trials, they need to be done carefully. We have to do it safely. We have to be very accurate. So there's not a lot of room for change. So we have a protocol that we follow. We're very rigorous, usually approved by regulatory agencies. And so we do things in a way that is very standardized so that the conclusions or the findings of the studies can actually be, when shown to the world, we actually learn from that and we can actually apply them moving forward. So just to clarify, when we talk about clinical trials, often we hear phase 1, phase 2, phase 3, phase 4, right? So what's that? So briefly saying, usually when we talk about a phase 1 clinical trial, the main purpose is to test safety. It tests the dose of a certain medication or the side effects, and in general includes small number of patients. Sometimes it's tested in cases where we've tried other treatments that didn't work anymore. Then we have phase 2 studies, and in general, they tend to test the efficacy of a specific treatment. So whether a treatment works, and it still monitors safety. We usually ask that question when we talk about treatments, right? We can also design phase 2 studies about sequencing, etc. But answering the question about a new treatment in general, that's what it is. Then we can talk about phase 3s. In general, those are large studies. It's using a large group of patients, part of the treatment. And the idea is to compare a new treatment or a new intervention to what's already being done currently. So we call that standard of care. So in general, we're comparing a new strategy, a new treatment to the standard of care in a large group of patients. Why is that important? Because if it's successful and if it's positive, it can lead to the regulatory approval of that treatment or intervention. And then if it gets approved, it gets to be done or offered widely. And finally, phase 4, we talked a little bit less about phase 4 studies, but in general, those studies are post-marketing surveillance studies. What that means is after the therapy or intervention is available, then there's this study to understand, can we monitor what's going on in the long term as far as safety and as far as outcomes? What that means is basically we make sure that intervention or that study, nothing wrong with that, right? There's no safety concerns, for example, from that perspective. So one thing that I would like to address before I give it back to Mark, it's about the misconceptions, right, about trials. So a big one is, oh my God, I'm going to be a guinea pig to be on a study. And in fact, there's a common sense, right? I'm going to be an experiment. I have no idea what that is. And so I should say, even for the phase 1 studies, that's not the case, because when we are putting the studies together, we are doing it with very promised agents that's backed up by strong laboratory data or early clinical data. And we have ethics committee that approves the studies. What that means is we make sure that whatever we're doing, whatever the intervention might be, it has been validated from an ethical perspective. The other aspect is I don't want to do it because I'll get a placebo, or trials are only exist for people that don't have any treatment options left. And I'd like just to say that in cancer trials, placebos are rare and almost never used by itself without a standard treatment. So the way we have to phrase this would be to say patients will always get at least the best known treatment to date when we're comparing, randomizing patients to a specific intervention or the standard of care or to a combination of the investigational drug. And then we do have clinical trials in different settings. So the fact that you might be offered a clinical trial in clinical practice, that doesn't mean there's nothing left available. We actually can do studies in the very beginning. So we have studies for early stage or for adjuvant or even for frontline, second line, etc. So that is a misconception as well, to think it's the last thing and there's nothing else. And then the last 2 points I'm going to make as final points is the sense that some folks I've heard saying, oh, I might lose control of my care or I never qualified for a study. Why would I do it? And so I'd just like to say for those comments, actually, on the contrary, trials follow a strict protocol and they're very closely monitored. So actually a lot often more closely monitored than standard practice. So you can always leave a trial at any single point in time. You can sign and the next second change your mind and come off, right? So you always have the control. And finally, qualification. The eligibility usually is very standard. So we know what it is. We don't change the rules in the middle of the game. And it's sometimes broader than we would expect. So that's the kind of conversations you certainly want to have with your care team to understand, okay, does that make sense to me? And by the way, do I qualify? And if yes, why do I qualify? So I would encourage you to have the conversations about the clinical studies, understanding the setting, and ask the misconceptions you might have, some ideas that you might have, and ask them to the care team. And oftentimes the care team will be able to answer those questions and address the needs from that perspective. Clinical trials, as a summary, are a fantastic way, perhaps the best way to handle the disease, including kidney cancer, and we are big advocates for clinical studies. So please ask your care teams about them when you are seeing them.
Thank you, Dr. Barata. Any questions for Dr. Barata? You can put it in the chat line and we'll get to them at the end of when the doctors are done speaking. Okay, my next topic is for Dr. Atkins. It's going to be what promising therapies are currently being studied in RCC trials, including combination therapies? Dr. Atkins.
Yeah, thank you, Mark, and thank you, Tracy, for including me. It's good to see you outside of the clinic setting. That was a very great description, Pedro, of clinical trials, and it's important to point out that when I first started treating kidney cancer in the Jurassic era, there were no treatments for kidney cancer at all. And now we have somewhere around 20 different treatments that are FDA approved for kidney cancer. And all of those are the result of clinical trials showing efficacy enough to have those approved. But we're not there yet. We're at a situation where the overall survival for patients with metastatic kidney cancer is much better than it used to be, 10 times longer in many cases, with maybe as much as a third of patients having long-term treatment-free survival. But we've got a long way to go until we get to where we want to be. And so we're still doing trials. And I'm going to just go through some of the trials that I think are most interesting to me. The first are some frontline trials, which involve immunotherapies and what are called checkpoint inhibitors. Most of you probably have heard of checkpoint inhibitors that go by brand names of Opdivo or Keytruda. They're advertised all the time on television. And one of the first places where those drugs were approved, I'll call them nivolumab and pembrolizumab, and another drug called ipilimumab, was in patients with kidney cancer. But there are opportunities from what we've studied in patients getting those drugs to understand the mechanisms of resistance, why people don't respond or respond and then have their disease progress. And there's some new trials that are out there that are specifically designed to attack those mechanisms of resistance and produce better results as initial treatment compared to standard of care. One trial that I'm leading is called the Architect trial, which is looking at a special Treg depleting CTLA-4 antibody together with an anti-PD-1 compared to nivolumab and ipilimumab. Another trial is a drug that's looking at a novel checkpoint inhibitor called relatlimab, or another one called fianlimab that inhibits another checkpoint called LAG3 that has been associated with escape from immune response in some settings. And so people are looking at adding that to the approved checkpoint inhibitors to see whether it will result in better outcomes. Other trials with immune therapy, and a long question about whether giving combinations of immune therapies is better than giving combinations of a VEGF receptor inhibitor together with an immune therapy, or you're giving first and second line therapy together, or just a combination first line therapy. And there's a trial in Europe that's finally addressing that question in a randomized phase 3 trial in the front line. So hopefully in a few years, we'll have actual real data rather than just debates on that question. And there's another trial looking at patients who just had their primary tumor in place and maybe metastatic disease, but before they had their nephrectomy, looking at the same either combination immunotherapy or immunotherapy plus an angiogenic therapy in the neoadjuvant setting before surgery, getting the surgery done, being able to look at the tissue to see what's actually happening, and then have people continue on whatever they were on. And that trial is called the PROBE trial, and it's being conducted in the cooperative groups. Another trial is looking at HIF2 alpha inhibition, and HIF2 is a oncogene that drives many clear cell kidney cancers. And there's an approved drug called belzutifan in that space, but there's a trial called the LightSpark 011 trial, which is looking at moving potentially belzutifan early to be second line in combination with a drug called lenvatinib, which is a VEGF receptor TKI. So that combination compared to cabozantinib, which many would consider the standard of care in that second line setting in people who haven't received cabozantinib in the first line. And that trial is already accrued, and likely we're going to hear something soon about whether that was a positive trial, and then we'll have a new therapy for that setting. And then there's a new HIF2 alpha that's being investigated called casdatifan in the PEAK-1 trial that is being combined with cabozantinib and compared to cabozantinib alone, essentially, or cabozantinib plus placebo. And so that trial is just starting, and we'll get some additional information about this other HIF2 alpha inhibitor in this second line setting. And then there's some interesting novel cytokines, and it sounds like some people might be receiving those. Interleukin-2 was probably the first effective treatment for metastatic kidney cancer, but it was very toxic, had to be given as an inpatient, and not nearly effective enough. The checkpoint inhibitors are better, but interleukin-2 still works in patients who've progressed after checkpoint inhibitors. And a lot of companies have been looking at how do they give it in a more safe way that has a better therapeutic index. And companies like Werewolf, which I heard somebody here was getting a drug from Werewolf, is looking at an IL-2 that's conditionally active in the tumor microenvironment and isn't active in the periphery, and so hopefully reduces the toxicity a lot. Some other companies are looking at those drugs. Some companies are looking at other cytokines such as IL-12 or IL-18, and those all sort of fit in maybe in the second or third line setting where they're being tested. Another really interesting trial that caught my attention is a trial called the Traverse trial from a company called Allogene, which is looking at a CAR T cell, which is a novel T cell that has been created. It's not the patient's own T cells. It's a general T cell that is attacking two markers on the surface of kidney cancer. And in a clinical trial called the Traverse trial, there was a promising response rate of about a third in patients who received all prior therapies and had this CD70 target on their surface. And so we'll likely see more studies in that space, although I think that compound is not currently being investigated further. At the moment, there'll be probably trials open up to expand the number of patients on. Another interesting trial that was presented at GU ASCO this year, which I thought didn't get enough play, was in patients with a rare type of kidney cancer with a fumarate hydratase mutation, where an IO-TKI combination in China took this disease where we had no idea how to treat it, or where there was a treatment that was being developed at the NIH, and gave it lenvatinib and pembrolizumab and saw over a 90% response rate. So I think we're going to see more of checkpoint inhibitor studies in that patient population, which appears to be very immune responsive. And the final trial I'm going to mention is also a very interesting one. It's from a company called Oncarina, which is a Swedish company that has identified orelinin as a compound in a mushroom that grows in Sweden that is a pure nephrotoxin. If you take this mushroom, within 24 hours, your kidneys will shut down. And so they're investigating in patients who are on dialysis, whose kidneys don't work, whether this compound can kill off kidney cancers cells safely as a treatment for patients who've received all other treatments and aren't using their kidneys anyway. And so that study's been open in Sweden, and I think some other places in Europe, and will be opening in several places in the United States within the next 6 months to a year. So those are the ones that I found interesting. Maybe some of my colleagues have others that I didn't mention.
I have a follow-up question for you, Dr. Atkins.
Sure.
What AI tools are being applied in RCC clinical trials now, and how promising do you see their future impact?
Yeah, that's a great question. Everybody wants to know about AI. I think right now, the major role for AI is that looking for predictive biomarkers in pathology specimens where AI can look at it and see things that the human eye can't see. So that's number one. And potentially also looking at imaging where we can break down the pixels in a PET scan or a functional PET scan or an MRI and be able to see what type of cancer there is, or maybe see evidence of that this cancer might respond to a particular therapy, or after treatment starts, have a more sophisticated look at whether someone's responding. And along those same lines, I think there's a new biomarker that's being tested in clinical trials in the blood called KIM-1 that's being added to a lot of trials and may be an early predictor of who's at risk for disease recurrence in the adjuvant setting and who's might be, or an early look at who's responding and who's not responding in the metastatic setting. So once again, I open it up to my colleagues if I miss something important that is your favorite trial.
Does any of the other doctors have something to say about AI?
Not necessarily about AI, but I wanted to actually add, first of all, Dr. Atkins did very extensive look on the current portfolio in kidney cancer. And by the way, for the people who do not know Dr. Atkins, he was a pioneer of a lot of immunotherapy trial and mentored a lot of newer generation of GI oncologists. So thank you, Dr. Atkins, for all your expertise. Another clinical trials we are excited about, actually CAR T therapy, we call them, basically manipulating the immune cells in order to target certain receptors which are known to be expressed in kidney cancer. One of them we are opening here at Mayo, actually, with Arsenal Bio. It's called CAR-T targeting a receptor called carbonic anhydrase 9. I'm excited about that molecule. I had that molecule actually at the University of Iowa before moving here to Mayo Clinic. There's another receptor called CD70, which there is some excitement about that. So cellular therapy or CAR-T therapy is another field. There are other items called BICE. Now there are a few molecules in early development, early in the process.
Thank you, Dr. Zakharia.
Joseph, Mark, can I just add, just to remind, as we said, trials can talk about treatments, but can go beyond that. Maybe to your point is a good segue to say, I think we might have a new scan or a tracer, which we call like a special contrast for a scan coming up soon. And anhydrase carbonic 9 or CA9 is an example of that. So we might have for first time PET scans, which are normally not done for kidney cancer. That might actually change in the near future. So I just want to bring that up. And it's also based on a trial called Zircon. And there's an expanded access on that. So to Joseph and Mike's point. And then there's also other interventions that have not specifically related to a treatment, but also how you manage with surgery and radiation therapy. So the timing of surgery and the timing of radiation therapy in patients with advanced RCC is also being investigated. So I just want to expand that, if you will, as well, just to give you we're testing many different things, right? Which is, it can get overwhelming. And I think on the chat, there's this question about, oh my God, so many studies, how you can get track of all of it. And I think we're going to maybe address that later today by giving you resources online that are free, where you can actually look at them and identify the centers, whether it's UH or Mayo or Georgetown and other places of the country, or Huntsman, where you can have those studies. And by the way, we also connect to each other. So sometimes we ask our colleagues and ask if certain studies are available to recommend as well. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Barata.
Yeah, and if I can emphasize, I think Dr. Atkins did a wonderful job. If you think about a lot of the studies he highlighted, most of them anyway, were leveraging some component of the immune system, because this particular group of cancers, when we think about kidney cancers, many of them appear to be particularly sensitive or amenable to this type of approach, except like one of the trials that he mentioned is this trial called PROBE. A lot of these immune therapies appear to be particularly effective in treating the metastases, and sometimes not quite as effective at treating the primary kidney cancer itself. So just to emphasize, like one of those trials that you pointed out, we're looking at doing the field is looking at surgically intervening by resecting that sometimes more difficult to treat spot. And hopefully that theory is that then the immune therapy can mop up everything else. And this has really been being looked at in two different ways. One cooperative group study called the PROBE trial is doing it surgically to surgically remove the kidney mass. And then another cooperative group trial called Samurai is looking at radiation to radiate the primary kidney mass. So a lot of enthusiasm and interest in looking and leveraging different components of the immune system to treat cancer. And again, to Dr. Zakharia's point, a lot of this has been led over the past 20 years by Dr. Atkins and others. So I'm so glad he's here on the panel today.
Thank you, Dr. Maughn. Okay, my next one here is for Dr. Zakharia. It's safety, side effects, and quality of life. Dr. Zakharia, how is patient safety monitored during trials? How do side effects compare to standard treatments? And how is quality of life incorporated into trial designs? Dr. Zakharia?
Yeah, thank you, Mark, again, and thank you, Judy Nicholson Foundation, for the kind invitation. It's my pleasure to be here, and I recognize a few names here. Thank you, everybody, for joining this late. Dr. Barata already alluded to this actually earlier, and he stole my thunder by talking about the phase 1, phase 2, phase 3. As he very eloquently indicated that in phase 1 clinical trials, we basically look for safety as what we call primary objective. And that's basically when we have a molecule coming from the lab, 20 years of lab research that suggests this molecule could be effective, then it moves into the clinic, into a phase 1 clinical trial where primary endpoint is safety, and then looking for some signal of efficacy before it makes it to phase 2 and phase 3. So the general rule of thumb through the whole process of clinical trials is safety first. Our first rule is do no harm basically to our patients. And because of the nature of the designs of these clinical trials, for example, in the phase 1, because you were dealing with a new molecule, first in human, very small number of patients being treated, the frequency of visits are very, very frequent. Patients come to the cancer center very frequently, sometimes on a daily basis or every other day. The main reason for these frequent visits, mainly to watch for safety and side effects, to make sure that our patients are tolerating the treatment the way we hope they are, and they are not developing new concerning safety issues. And along that, we are repeating like labs routinely. We're doing EKGs to monitor the heart. We're doing echocardiograms. We are doing all these measures to watch for side effects and to make sure we are not damaging the kidney, for example, or we are not damaging the liver. So all these are very extensive measures we do in our clinical trials in order to make sure it is safe measure for our patients. As we get further along from phase 1 to phase 2 to phase 3, basically we have gained significant experience over the years, and the large number of patients who have been treated in phase 1 and 2s, then the frequency of visits or the frequency of visits become less and less because we have learned more about the safety of the drug. So those measures of monitoring EKGs and monitoring labs become less frequent as you move from phase 1 all the way to phase 3. So how do the side effects compare to the standard of care? This is very loaded question, and it's hard to answer straightforward because it's simply you're comparing apples to oranges. When the drug becomes a standard of care, as Dr. Barata mentioned earlier, has been through like 10 years of experience from phase 1 to phase 3s before it becomes an FDA approved. So we have gained a lot of experience over the years. And even in phase 4, we continue to watch post-marketing, we call it, for safety if there is any new safety signal arises. So when the drug becomes standard of care, we have really learned a lot about it over the years. As opposed when the drug is on a clinical trial, depending on the phase, we're watching the patient much more closely in order to make sure that there's no alarming safety signal resulting from that new drug that we're testing. The quality of life, very important topic. As we are getting more and more sophisticated in designing clinical trials, we are implementing certain tools, we call them POS or patient-reported outcomes. Basically, these are certain surveys we distribute to the patients, asking them about their daily living, their daily quality of life. How is it? Are you getting more fatigue? Are you getting more pain? How's your mentality doing? How's your emotions? How are your emotions doing? So all these, what we call ROs or patient-reported outcomes, we are paying close attention to make sure that we are not impacting the quality of life of our patients. I have to admit though, like sometimes when we have like very effective treatment, we accept some sacrifice in the quality of life with the hope that we are gaining more long-term benefit from the drug. For example, the ipilimumab and nivolumab or Opdivo Yervoy, many of you might have heard about it or experienced it in clinic perhaps. We know this combination can have significant side effects in some patients and can impact their quality of life, but hopefully for the 3 or 4 months that they are getting the treatment. But the gain out of this combination, if the patients respond very well to this, they might be cured at 5 years. We have up now about 40-50% of our patients with metastatic kidney cancer with this regimen living like beyond 5 and close to 10 years now. We have data long-term follow-up on this. So we accept certain sacrifice. Sometimes, obviously, we discuss all this with our patients. The patient need to accept this risk, obviously, too, in order to achieve long-term gain from this. So all these are being monitored very closely by the investigators, the physician, the whole team surrounding the patients, and they are being vetted very carefully by different committees too, as let's call it a third party, to make sure nothing is being missed in the whole process.
Good. I got a follow-up for you, Dr. Zakharia. Dr. Barata covered it a little bit, but you can go into more depth with it. Can you also address common ethical concerns patients have about placebos and how these are managed in RCC clinical trials?
Very good question, and I get this quite a bit whenever I mention the word clinical trial to my patients. Actually, the two common words I hear, the guinea pig that already my friend Pedro mentioned, and the other thing, the concern about the placebo. I usually tell my patients up front, placebo, we only give it for patients who have, or the alternative would be observation. For example, in the adjuvant pembrolizumab trial, we call it the Keynote 564, which led to the pembrolizumab or Keytruda FDA approval after surgery. The standard of care at that time basically was the observation. So patients were on this clinical trial were randomized to either getting pembrolizumab versus placebo, because the alternative to that placebo would have been the observation. So patient basically is not losing much by doing. The other example that comes to mind where we utilize or justify using placebo is when we are adding it on top of the standard of care. For example, the trial that Dr. Atkins mentioned earlier, the PEAK-1, is in second line and beyond metastatic kidney cancer, where the standard of care, currently acceptable standard of care called cabozantinib, we are comparing in this clinical trial adding a drug, which is a HIF-2 alpha inhibitor, on top of cabozantinib versus cabozantinib and placebo. So the patient is not getting below the standard of care. At least they are getting the cabozantinib in both arms, which is acceptable standard of care. Half of the patients are getting casdatifan on top of the cabozantinib, the other half is getting placebo. And I always tell my patients with these type of trials that involve placebo, don't feel bad about getting placebo, if actually you are randomized to the placebo arm, don't feel bad, because simply we do not know if the aggressive treatment, the other arm, is working better than. That's why we are testing this. So a lot of patients feel like, okay, if I go on a placebo arm, I'm going to withdraw, or I have second thoughts about the trial. Obviously, the patients have the right to withdraw at any time, as Dr. Barata mentioned earlier on the trial, but we always suggest to avoid that withdrawal, to keep the integrity of the trial and to learn really what we are hoping to learn from the trial. So in my opinion, placebo should not be a concern, because again, for the scenarios that I mentioned to you, the patient is not being under-treated by the placebo.
Thank you, doctor. Is anyone, other panelists have anything to add to that? Okay, the next one is for Dr. Maughn, impact and challenges. Dr. Maughn, what recent advances in RCC treatments have come from clinical trials? And what are some of the challenge in trial design today, our biggest challenges in trial design today?
Thanks, Mark. I appreciate those questions because it makes me think back to my childhood, if you will, in medicine. I certainly haven't been involved in this field for as long as Dr. Atkins, but before I was a physician, I was an oncology pharmacist, and that was back in 2004. And at that time, we had very few tools to treat this disease. And the tools that we did have were largely ineffective for most patients, unfortunately. And because of that, the average survival for patients was 12 months or less. Most patients were dying within a year, sometime within a year of being diagnosed with having metastatic disease. It was really terrible tragedy. And so when I think about this question, I think about what are some of those recent advances. Recent's a subjective term, but I just think about the tremendous innovations that have come. We're still not a long ways, but we're still short of our goal of curing like most or all patients with these cancers. So there's still a lot of work that needs to be done. But when I think about the successes that we've achieved, it makes me really happy and grateful. Just a couple of those that come to my mind, as has been mentioned before, let me emphasize it. Some of these immune therapies with checkpoint inhibitors are allowing patients to be alive for many years. At GeoASCO, we just had the final follow-up presented for the original Checkmate 214 study, which was looking at two checkpoint inhibitors together of Opdivo and Yervoy. Those are the brand names. The generic names, in case you're more familiar with that, is ipilimumab and nivolumab. Fairly large proportion of patients were still alive 8 years plus after being diagnosed with their disease. That's a transformative change. And to me, I've seen some of these patients be, at least in my opinion, cured of their cancer with immune therapy. But we're not curing enough. So there's a lot of work that still needs to be done to provide additional treatments. So I would say the biggest advance that I can think of that's occurred, at least in the past 10 years, has been the introduction of checkpoint inhibitors, which have allowed immune therapies to be effective for most patients today. Whether you're looking at the responses to Ipi/Nivo or you're looking at the responses to these various TKI-IO combinations, like when you had cabozantinib or axitinib or lenvatinib to checkpoint inhibitors. That's been a tremendous advance. The other, I think, interesting advance that I will admit has been controversial in the field, at least scientifically speaking, has been the data about adjuvant pembrolizumab. And adjuvant just means after surgery, right? We know that patients that at least we think have localized disease and receive surgery or sometimes radiation or cryotherapy for that with the intention of curing them, we know that a large proportion of those patients are ultimately not cured. Roughly back of the napkin sort of estimation, it can be upwards of 50% of patients, depending on the extent of their disease. And so clearly a lot of those patients aren't cured because they already have microscopic metastases somewhere in their body that we just can't see with conventional imaging, like a CT scan or something. So we're hoping that some newer diagnostic tests will help us find these spots better. The V9 PET scan that Dr. Barata was referencing earlier. But we're also hoping that we can develop some treatments that will help us eradicate these microscopic metastases. And the study investigators continue to present longer and longer term follow-up from the adjuvant pembrolizumab study. And I will say that the data is looking very interesting and provocative, that it might be improving the survival or maybe curing some patients with this disease. curing more patients with locally advanced disease than we can achieve with surgery alone. So that's another very interesting recent advance for this disease. And then finally, the other thing I would emphasize is because the way that I explain our treatments to patients, to my patients today, is that what I like to think of as immune therapy is the backbone of treatment. That's hopefully going to help them achieve very long responses, maybe a cure. But unfortunately, not everybody is getting that. So I like to think of these targeted therapies that we have, many of which have been alluded to recently, as the bridge, getting them between one immune therapy treatment and the next. Because these targeted therapies they're not a pathway to cure by themselves, but they work very consistently so they can halt the disease, they can control the disease, and hopefully get us from one immune therapy experience to another clinical trial of a novel immune therapy, for instance. And there's been a lot of advances with developing new, better, more effective, and sometimes more tolerable targeted therapies. Some recent advances I can think of just over the past few years with cabozantinib and lenvatinib being particularly potent and useful targeted therapies. Cabozantinib and belzutifan also being quite potent, but quite tolerable, better than most other targeted therapies we've had to date. So there's been a lot of advances, and I'm very grateful for them. They're not sufficient, right? We still need to push forward and find even better treatments, but I'm grateful for the progress that we've achieved. I got myself all distracted. I think you had another question embedded in there. And
That's okay. That's fine. That's fine. I was interested. Thank you. I do have a question. What barriers do patients face when trying to access clinical trials, such as distance, cost, insurance, and what support resources are typically available?
That's a great question. So not to be too contrary, but I think a lot of those examples that you suggested actually aren't so much barriers. Perhaps they were years ago, but not so much anymore in terms of like cost or insurance. And that's because when a clinical trial is instituted, for the most part, the way I think about it is there's two like pockets of money, right? Typically, there's things that are going to be done anyway, whether the patient's enrolled on a clinical trial or whether they decide not to do a trial and they're just receiving standard of care, right? So many doctor's visits, certain blood draws, for instance, things like that. And those are things that because we're going to do anyway, the insurance company pays for them. Those parts are always standardly paid for by insurance. The unique things that are novel that we're doing only because a patient is on a clinical trial, those components are paid for by the trial itself. So generally speaking, participating in a trial should not be increasing the cost to a patient. Now, sometimes that's not entirely true because when you think about participating in the trial may require more frequent visits. So then there's the cost of like taking time off of work, or so those sort of hidden costs in a trial sometimes can be a problem for patients. Many of the trials have ways to try to address that, at least in some way, usually not completely, but to some degree with travel reimbursement and things like that. What I see as the biggest barriers to participation in trials today is a consequence of our better understanding of the disease. As we are better understanding these diseases that compromise kidney cancer, we're starting to think about them and separate them into distinct different cancers, right? So before there used to be fewer buckets or fewer different types of cancers that we recognized, and now we're separating those into even more specific diseases. And so there's more diagnoses. One example that Dr. Atkins was highlighting was FH deficient disease. This used to be with this umbrella that we called papillary kidney cancer. And now we realize it's separate, distinct in its molecular makeup, in how this cancer behaves and what's making it be cancer. And there's additional examples of that. And so as we're better understanding the biology, we're making smaller and smaller pockets, right? There's fewer people that have FH deficient disease than in the past you defined as like all papillary kidney cancer, right? So this is a good thing and it's a challenge, right? The good thing is we're getting closer to understanding these cancers. And as we understand them better, we can devise more specific treatments tailored to how that specific cancer works, and therefore hopefully can be more effective. But the challenge is, as though we're doing this, we're creating smaller and smaller buckets, which makes it harder for patients to enroll, and it makes it logistically difficult to conduct these clinical trials. So that's one of the challenges with conducting these. I would say that's one of the biggest challenges to clinical trial design going forward in this upcoming decade is how do we design, execute, and conduct these clinical trials based on very specific disease parameters.
Does anybody in the panel have anything to add?
Yeah, I wanted to add something about this.
Dr.
I think,
Atkins.
one of the barriers, an additional barrier that we face is our own success. So with all the new treatments that are out there, patients who generally will go to their local oncologist now can be offered any number of therapies. And compared to the past where there weren't treatments and they would head to a place where there was a clinical trial, they may not know about clinical trials or understand that there might be better treatments than the ones that are approved that could be available. And programs like this that hopefully explain what clinical trials are about and how they are what's necessary to raise the bar for survival for these patients can really help to address that particular barrier. So thank you very much for putting this on.
Okay. Tracy, we got any questions from the crowd?
Going to go ahead and unmute myself. Yes, we do. We have several questions. I see that our panel of experts have been answering some of them, so thank you for paying attention to that. I would need to scroll all the way at the top, but I'm just going to start from the bottom and then work my way up. I think we have plenty of time. So Michelle asked, did you want me to go ahead and read it, Mark, or would you like me to take it over? Okay, great.
Go ahead.
Would having a genetic-based cancer, specifically BAP1, make it more difficult to be accepted into a trial in fear of lessening the integrity of the trial? I'll leave that to the panelists to answer. Guess it's open.
Anyone?
Maybe I'll start. The BAP1 is a relatively common mutation in kidney cancer. It's probably the third most common mutation, goes along with a VHL mutation, and all trials for clear cell kidney cancer will include patients who have BAP1. Mutation shouldn't be an obstacle. We're not really at a point where we have specific trials for one mutant clear cell kidney cancer, but it's conceivable in the future that might be the case.
Thank you so much.
Actually, just to expand on that, it's also true we don't really have strong biomarkers to say biomarker X, we should do a completely different approach. We could talk a little bit about details about MET alterations, for example, for a less common type called papillary RCC, but the therapy that has been considered standard, cabozantinib, does have anti-MET activity, for example. But right now, we're not having a pure precision medicine approach in general for kidney cancer, as we see in other tumors. So when we're reading things about precision medicine, genomic-based treatments, we have a way to improve there. We have room for improvement, I would say, in kidney cancer. With that said, genetic testing might be offered to you, and that would explain not only the genes you were born with from your mommy and daddy, called germline testing, but also genomic alterations at the tumor level. And that can be informative, but right now we're not, a standard of care at least, we're not going by biomarker one gets a treatment which is completely different from others. And I'll keep it like this as simple. We can expand a little bit on some specifics, but Dr. Atkins' point is very good.
Excellent. Does anybody else want to follow up or?
Yeah, only one other comment.
Okay.
There are a few clinical trials trying to take this biomarker approach. If you have gene X, maybe we do this treatment, and if you have gene Y, we do this treatment. But by and large, most trials that have been done recently or are currently ongoing are not taking that approach. And that's
Great.
true. Oftentimes we describe like kidney cancer, we fall into saying that, but we recognize there's multiple different types of kidney cancer, multiple unique diagnoses. That comment applies pretty much across the board for all types of kidney cancer, generally speaking.
Thank you, Dr. Maughn.
Thank you, Dr. Maughn. I had a question about CAR T cell therapy. I think you touched on it, Dr. Atkins, I think. Off the shelf CAR T cell therapy. Was it you?
Yeah. Yes, I mentioned it, and Yusuf also mentioned it. But that's the company from Allogene, which has made a CAR that attacks essentially CD70, which is a marker on many kidney tumors. And a lot of CAR T-cell therapies use your own cells and modify them, but they've made it so it's a cell that's generic that you can take off the shelf and give to anybody. And they've modified the cells so it won't be recognized as foreign by the host immune system or be attacking other parts of the host immune system to some degree.
Thank you. So I'm going to jump back up. Joel had an excellent question, and I'm not sure if our panelists already answered this in the chat, but I'll go ahead and say it for those that didn't see it. Joel said, one of the most common questions we get is, no one doctor in our RCC world knows all the trials that are out there. So what is the best resource to find these clinical trials for a patient? Obviously, settings like JNF, there are open forums. That's a great way to find out. But is there one source, website maybe? I'll open up to the floor.
Yeah, I can take that question. It's actually a great question. And I don't blame any doctor for not knowing all the ongoing clinical trials because the field is really exploding very fast. Your doctor, especially if they're not like specialists within the kidney cancer field, might not know all the ongoing clinical trials. Common resource is the clinicaltrial.gov. I think somebody listed it in the chat. Very easy to use website. You can just type it in and there are like 3 or 4 different boxes. You can type in, if you put just kidney cancer clinical trials, you can put your geographic areas and it lists you all the ongoing clinical trials. So that is very easy tool. But certainly the foundations like Judy Nicholson Foundation, Kidney Can, KCRS, IKCS, all those KCA, they have all these websites and a lot of patients advocate there and they know a lot of what's happening in the field. Sometimes word of mouth can be helpful too. Facebook pages, other social media pages. So all these resources are available to you. But I would say the one that is, I feel like that captures majority of ongoing clinical trial is, or if not all, I would say, the clinicaltrial.gov, because technically any clinical trial that opens need to be listed there.
Thank you so much. And I think I saw that Glenn Sykes added that email link in the chat. It's in there if anybody wants to see that again. Okay, let me move on to another question, and I'm bouncing around. It looks like Glenn had a question about cellular trials, but we touched on that a little bit. Did anybody want to expand on that?
Tracy, if I can, just to put this in context, the way I think about it is immune therapy is like saying tree, right? Like it's a very broad general term that's just saying in some way we're getting the immune system to help fight the cancer. And then you can accomplish that or leverage that through very specific ways or mechanisms. So now in terms of this tree analogy, we're talking about, is this a blue spruce? Is this an aspen? Is it right? So there's a lot of specific types of trees, right? And I think about it as 3 subcategories. So the broad category is immune therapy. And the 3 subcategories are checkpoint inhibitors, cytokines, and cellular therapy, right? So checkpoint inhibitors are those things we've talked about so much today. Things like Opdivo and Yervoy and Keytruda. The cytokines used to be used much more. Dr. Atkins highlighted a couple of those examples too. IL-2, TNF-alpha, interferon alpha. So those are cytokines. They're making some resurgence in clinical trials and in melanoma. And then finally, there's this very hot topic of cellular therapies. That's a whole category in and of itself. There's a variety of different approaches, but these are like, in general, think about it like you're engineering the cell. You're taking some cell and you're changing it. It's a little too simplistic, but because you also have like BITE cells and T-cell engagers and whatever. But instead of doing some chemical to help your native immune cell have the effect in fighting cancer, you're taking a cell and you're engineering it in the lab and you're making it different in some way, and then that's going to go on. You're making it a super soldier. It's the Captain America version of this, to use a Marvel analogy. But that's like, those are the 3 separate mechanisms of what these are.
Great. I love that analogy. Sorry, guys. I'm just scrolling through to make sure that I'm not missing anybody's question here.
Question I'd like to ask, I think it was already covered, Tracy, is as far as a second line for an immunotherapy or a third line for an immunotherapy, like after Opdivo, Yervo, which is an example, there's no real second line for immunotherapy or third line, a TKI, and then you know what I'm getting at? Anyone want to take that up?
Yeah. So there's no second line standard of care, and some of the studies which have looked at giving the same type of drug that you received in the first line in the second line together with, let's say, a TKI have shown no benefit from giving immune therapy again. But there are some of these studies going on with cytokines, with CAR T cells, or with novel combinations of checkpoint inhibitors may be in that second line setting for patients who progressed on first line immune therapy, and hopefully some of them will show enough activity to eventually be approved in that setting. And many of those, if they show activity in that setting of immune therapy resistance, may eventually be moved into the first line.
Great. So I think I've covered most of the questions that weren't already answered in the chat, but if anybody has some additional questions, can you, did I skip? I can't. I'm sorry. Can you go ahead and raise your hand so I know who is asking the question? And I might have skipped some. It's hard to follow along here. Did somebody have a question that is raising their hand? Okay, I don't see anybody raising their hand, so I think we've covered everything.
I see one here, Tracy, about...
Do you? Okay.
I wanted to ask about V940. Is that a trial? Anyone know anything about that? That's the only one I see.
Yeah, that's a vaccine trial.
Okay, yeah.
It's an mRNA vaccine from a company called Moderna that has shown some activity in the adjuvant setting with pembrolizumab in patients with melanoma. And that similar study is now being done in adjuvant setting in patients with kidney cancer.
I think he's sponsored by Merck, right, mate?
Yes.
Mark.
Yeah.
With the Moderna vaccine, which is essentially mRNA from the tumor that's made into, that's injected, same way you get antibodies to COVID or get immunity. The COVID vaccine through an mRNA vaccine from Moderna or Pfizer. Same principle. They were actually studying this in cancer before the pandemic, and that's why they were able to pivot so quickly to develop those vaccines for COVID.
Very interesting. Thank you so much. It looks like we've covered all the questions and we are a little past 7:30. I just want to thank our panel of experts again. Thank Mark Hyatt for an excellent job moderating, and all of our guests tonight, our patients, caregivers, and loved ones, everybody who's joined the conversation. I thought it was excellent. I learned a lot tonight, and I hope you did too. Again, this is being videotaped, and it will be on our YouTube page. And if you follow us on our Judy Nicholson Facebook page, we are also on LinkedIn and Instagram. We will let everybody know when that's ready for viewing. So thank you so much, everybody, and have a wonderful evening. Good night. Thank you, guys.
Good night.
Thank you.
Thank you all.